Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for giving this opportunity today to come and talk on enumeration of probiotics in finished formats. Before I get into details of that, I'd like to give you an overview of the background that we have in this field as a company, IFF Health and Biosciences. So our journey with cultures and probiotics really started back in the early last century, where we started this work as part of the Marshall laboratories in the US. And here we were working mainly with starter cultures and food enzymes that were used in cheese making. Much has changed since that time. And since in the years following that, we have had a number of large companies, culture-based companies, probiotic companies joining our efforts, bringing their own expertise into the company. And today we have expertise in a whole range of different areas related to genetics, genomics, classification, identification, clinical research related to probiotics, and many other things. So today we have R&D facilities or R&D departments all over the world. Most of them are located in the United States, but we also have facilities in Europe, in Asia, including India and China. We have them in even an application group in Australia, and this is where I'm coming from. The most relevant, I think, activities that is relevant for this presentation here today, it's by our genomics team in the US. And here in the US, we have much of the identification, the PCR work, developments ongoing. So that's being conducted in this part of the world. Okay, so what I'd like to focus on today is enumeration and some of the practical challenges that are facing us, that we are faced with today, in terms of enumerating probiotics in these finished formats, particularly over the course of shelf life, ensuring that we have the correct level of probiotics at the end of shelf life. So when we talk about finished formats, it's, for instance, sachets. It could be probiotic sachets. It could be chewable tablets. It could be oil drops. It could be probiotic capsules. These type of formats have one thing in common, and it's that they contain relatively low levels of water and moisture. And in products that have low levels of moisture, we also have the opportunity to give them very long shelf life, because probiotics that are dormant tend to be stable for a very long time in these type of products. Now, we have seen a very strong growth in these type of products over the years globally, and particularly, I think, in Asia Pacific and in Australia. So what we see in many parts of the world, including Australia, are these very often high potency products, so high level of probiotics being used, and also a large number of probiotic strains being used in these products. Here we need to make sure that these products are meeting label claim at the end of shelf life. And that's usually not a problem if we are looking at the total count, but when we have challenges, in relation to monitoring specific strains and stability of a specific strain over the course of shelf life of these products. Now, there are some really exciting developments in this area that our teams are working on at the moment. And these are, for instance, PCR-based methods, so digital droplet PCR, for instance, which will allow us to identify very specific strains and separate even closely related strains from each other. Now, the problem with these methods, though, is that we are not always able to identify which strains are alive and which ones are dead. So PCR is based on enumeration of number of genomes, regardless of whether cells are dead or alive, and that poses a challenge if we are doing a viability test, right? We really need to make sure that we only count cells that are viable. And I think that this is where these type of method poses a challenge today. In fact, I can't see that we will implement these on a commercial scale to be used by commercial labs for enumeration within the next 4 or 5 years. We may be able to apply them at a research level, at research labs, but at a commercial scale, we still need some more time to develop and validate these type of methods. So the question is, what do we have to our disposal at this stage? What type of methods do we have available at this stage? Well, we have total count methods, of course, that can be used. And in most part of the world, it's sufficient to just ensure that we have the claimed level, the total level of probiotics present in a product. There is no need to get into any further detail. But there are opportunities with there's some significant opportunities with these type of methods, both total count methods, genus-specific method, and even species-specific methods. And there are a number of methods available, and they're currently being used all over the world today, and many of these are ISO methods, so well-characterized, very well-validated methods. We also have more internal methods that have been validated and can be used if needed. I just want to highlight one of the challenges with a lab using a method for enumeration, and that is that even very similar methods, widely accepted methods for instance, total cell count or total bifidal count, even these methods can give significant variation in results. So this is an example where we are looking at the BL agar. So this is a media that's commonly used. It was used very much in Korea some years ago, recommended by the KFDA, I believe. And this is the result that you get on this particular media is compared with a simple MRS media that's widely used for enumeration of lactic acid bacteria. And what you can see here is that you have a 40% difference in the count. So the MRS media will typically give you a 40% higher count. Now, this is relevant from a formulation perspective because what it would mean that if we would use the BL agar in the QC testing, we will basically have to formulate with 40% higher levels of probiotics in the Finnish format when we design the products. So it's relevant for product design. Now, if we want to select convert this into a selective media that only detects bifidobacteria, then we will add selective agents into the BL agar, and this agar that we get then with the selective agent is called BS agar. And as you can see here, you get even a lower count as compared to the BL agar. So selective pressure and selective methods may give a significantly lower count than a non-selective media. Okay, so just to give you an example, this is from a study, a development by our team in the US. They were looking at developing and validating two different methods, one for selective enumeration of bifido, one for selective enumeration of lactobacillus, or the former group of lactobacillus. You know that this genus has now been divided in multiple genera. So what we need to make sure when we validate methods like this is that a particular strain of lactobacillus, or a strain of Lactobacillus acidophilus, for instance, will give the same count on the genus-specific media as the general media, the non-selective media. And that needs to be tested for all the different strains that we would use in the formulation of a finished format product, multi-strain product. We also need to make sure that none of the other strains that we are combining, including in these finished formats, can grow. So none of the bifidos, for instance, that we have in this table here. So they need to match up. So it's very important that we do this kind of validation before we introduce them and start to use them in the lab for QC testing. Now, one of the issues that external labs very often are facing is, and internal labs as well, by the way, is variability of methods. So methods tend to give a variation in the results that we get if we're retesting samples over and over again. And this can be a significant problem, and it's well recognized. So it's generally recognized that we may see a 0.3 to 0.5 log deviation from the expected count. And this is from a USP document. So it's well recognized. But what is this, or does it have to be that's great? Well, in many cases, it is much worse than that, in fact. This is from a study that we conducted a few years ago. We have 3 probiotic strains, 3 batches, 1 batch of each strain. We are sending 3 samples out of each batch for each strain to external labs. And we were sending these samples out to 2 external labs in Australia. And we are asking the lab to use our recommended method and to report the results back to us. And what we can see here is that in some cases we have very significant deviations in results. So this is a 0.6 log lower count than what we expect. In this case, it's 0.4 log higher than expected count, and in this case, 0.35 log. So some quite significant variations. Now, this is when we are sending samples out blinded to the lab, so the labs are not aware of that they're involved in the proficiency test. If we are using a lab that is aware of that they're involved in the proficiency test, they are using the correct method in enumeration, as in this example, for instance. Here we are looking at a trial where we are using 5 labs involved in the study. We are sending out a total of 600 samples out of 1 batch of bifidobacteria that should theoretically have exactly the same cell count. And we are asking the labs to enumerate and return the results to us. This is the results we get. So we get, so what you can see at most of these results are accumulated around the average. But you see some significant deviations in some cases. Now the 12.04 and 11.27 represents 3 times the standard deviation. Plus and minus three times the standard deviation. So this is what we sort of can expect if we are dealing with labs that are trained and are use the methods in detail as it's been described. Now this deviation here corresponds to 0.13 log. So significantly lower than 0.3 or 0.5 log. 0.3 or 0.5 log is what we have here. So this is 0.3 log, and this is 0.5 log. So as we see, if we work with labs that are experienced, we see typically lower deviation. But in many cases, we do see deviation, but it doesn't happen very often. Okay, so how do we go about proficiency testing of labs? Well, all labs will do proficiency testing using different methods. I think sometimes we're not doing that enough when it comes to probiotics. And I will just show you very briefly how we typically do a proficiency test for any labs that we are using. And we would send out, say, 8 samples to a lab, and we ask the lab to follow a method and to have the testing conducted by 2 technicians over 2 days using 2 media batches. And the results that we typically will get from these types, this is just an example, so I shouldn't say that it's typical, but in this case, we see that the results are very closely focused, well within the boundaries of the 3 times standard deviations. So the variation is not actually that great. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about formulation and some of the things and how we consider some of these aspects when we formulate a dietary supplement that could be for Vietnam or somewhere else in the world. So there are many things that we need to consider when we formulate. And one of the most important properties or things to consider is the stability of the probiotic strains that we intend to use in our finished format. And we know that the stability of different strains may vary significantly. So in the graph to the left here, you see the stability of our Bifidobacterium lactis HN019. And what you can see here is a viability drop of the course of shelf life, which is 24 months in this case. In this case, it's incubated at 25 degrees Celsius. If we would incubate at ICH zone 4B, which typically is applied in Vietnam, we would see slightly greater viability losses. But this is just as an example. So we have 65% remaining at the end of shelf life. In the case of this strain here, the Lactobacillus acidophilus NCFM, we have 40% remaining after the end of shelf life. So when we design our products, we know what to expect in terms of stability, and we can compensate for those viability losses by adding an overage. And by adding this overage, we know with great certainty that these strains will survive at this level in these type of dietary supplements. So there is no real need for a strain-specific enumeration of the course of shelf life. Okay, there are many other things that also will influence stability of probiotics and the way that we design our probiotic finished format. So other ingredients that are being used in the format, for instance, we know that water activity has an impact on stability. So we need to know the water activity of those ingredients that we use and adjust the overages according to the water activity. We need to know, we need to ensure that we use packaging material with low water vapor transmission rate to make sure that we don't get moisture transfer into the dietary supplement over the course of shelf life. We need to consider methods that we use for testing and the variability of results. So we need to add an assay buffer to adjust for variability that a lab will give. And all of these factors are then considered to determine what overages are needed for a particular formulation. So based on this, we are in a very good position to use QBI, so quantity by input, as long as we have this information. So there is a less of a need to identify individual strains in the format, because we know the stability of each one of the strains under these conditions. Now that reasoning, though, assumes that we have no interaction between different strains in a blend. And is that the case? Well, we know for dairy products, for instance, where strains are metabolically active, that we do see an interaction between strains, and they may affect each other's stability. But in this case, the strains are freeze-dried, so they are not metabolically active, they are dormant. So how do we know that we don't have interactions between strains during shelf life? Well, this is something that we have tested. And I will just show you some results from a study that was completed recently. It's looking at the stability of 6 different strains when they are either used on their own in a dietary supplement or when they are used in combination with 5 other strains. So these are formulations that were put on stability at 30 degrees Celsius, and we are monitoring stability for 12 months. Now, if we look at the results here, we see in each graph 2 lines. The blue line represents stability of a particular strain. In this case, the blue line represents a single strain of Lactobacillus plantarum. The orange line and dots represent a combination of the same strain in combination with 5 other strains. And what you can see in all cases here, there is no difference. So a strain will survive equally well if it's used on its own or in combination with other strains. So there is no interaction between these strains in a finished format of this nature. This is what we can conclude from this. So I think to summarize some of the key messages here, I think some of these very exciting methods that are based on digital PCR, it's anticipated that these will be valuable tools to determine stability of probiotics in complex blends of probiotics in the future. However, we need more work to develop these, validate, and implement these methods for routine testing at commercial scale. In the meantime, selective agar and methods give opportunities for genus-specific and strain and species-specific enumeration to monitor stability. Having said, though, that it's critical to validate the methods, making sure that we get the same count of these methods as on non-selective media of the strains that we're using in the blend. Also, highlighting the importance of making sure that the lab we are using in testing has undergone proficiency testing, and we know that the labs perform well. If they don't perform well, we may have to support with additional training. And when it comes to formulation, we can be reasonably good, certainly use QBI as a way of developing formulations, as long as we have a good understanding of the inherent properties of stability of the strains that we used in the blend. And that would help us then determine to what extent we need to use overages and what type of overages we need to use. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.